Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone joining this very warm summer water cooler chat with KETOS today. I'm Meena Sankaran, the founder and CEO of KETOS, and I'm very grateful to all of you for your time and interest. It's incredible to think we're coming up on first half of the year already, and a lot of transformative work is already happening very excitingly in the world of water. KETOS, as many of you might be aware, is a real-time water intelligence solution that's continuing to make huge strides with customers in industrial, municipal, and agricultural space. Getting actionable data in your fingertips for an operator to securely and proactively manage their own plant infrastructure with a $0 purchase budget and 0 labor hours is becoming top of mind. So along those lines, comes a very important topic that's near and dear to all of us, is compliance. To speak further and share thoughts on this topic are two very esteemed guests and near and dear friends, Brent Fewell and Joe Britton. Joe is the principal at Pioneer Public Affairs and executive director of the Zero Transportation Association. Joe has spent past 15 years working at the US Senate in various roles, serving as legislative assistant, Deputy Chief of Staff, Legislative Director, and Chief of Staff. During his time on the Hill, Joe has helped lead a number of major healthcare, public lands, appropriations, and budgeting policy decisions. A very impressive track record indeed. Welcome, Joe. Brent is a leading environmental lawyer and policy professional with over 26 years experience. He's the founder and chair of Earth and Water Law Group. He's been a partner with Troutman Sanders and worked in several law firms. He's acted in the capacity of Senior Vice President of United Water. He's also served as a Principal Deputy Assistant Administrator at the US EPA and has been responsible for overseeing all facets of EPA water programs, developmental, implementation, all across enforcement and compliance. He's also worked at several engineering firms, kind of working through restoring contaminated projects, potentially strategic and compliance counseling, due diligence, and overall enforcement defense. Welcome, Brent. So,
thank you, Meena.
As we kickstart here, it's an absolute honor to have both of you. And, I have several topics that might be of very high interest to our audience, and also some establishing a bit of the foundational elements to help our audience kind of gain some insight into regulations, enforcement policies, and also legislative changes that can be influenced by who's in charge. So maybe Brent, you can kickstart this. What's some of your take on the regulatory priorities associated with the new administration?
Meena, well, I think those that are joining us today, most of them are probably familiar with what we call the water infrastructure crisis, where many communities are struggling to maintain their systems. There are thousands of systems, public water systems, that are in significant non-compliance, raising all kinds of concerns about public health risks. We know that there's a real focus on lead contamination in drinking water. And so this administration, like the last administration, is focused on really trying to help bridge the divide of the real needs and the cost and associated with upgrading these systems. And I think it's fair to say that Democratic administrations a lot of times will see more regulations, and so there's going to be a real focus on compliance in this administration going forward.
Got it. And Joe, how do you see this from your lens over here?
Well, so I think there's 3 kind of vectors that really lend towards a more regulatory environment. One is natural, one is legislative, and one is political. And on the natural front, I think we are increasingly focused. If you look at the droughts out west and the expected climate impacts that we're going to see in the years to come, there's just a scarcity of water, and I think there's an attention and focus on making sure that we're using it wisely and that there's high quality and monitoring that goes along with it. So that's the natural vector that I think is lending towards increased compliance and regulatory oversight. The second is legislative. So obviously we passed at the end of last year the Water Resources Development Act. This week actually in the US House, as part of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee bill moving, they're adding the 2021 Water Resources Development Act. And then I think folks have been probably paying attention to the bipartisan negotiations on this big infrastructure package that was kicked off when President Biden announced the American Jobs Plan. In that bipartisan package, there's another $55 billion. And I think, as one might imagine, when Congress is spending money on things, strings tend to become attached. And so I think as Congress is investing and we're putting federal resources behind infrastructure, there's going to be, I think, an effort to ensure that there's accountability and that we're meeting the right outcomes and metrics. And then that's the legislative path. And then the third is more political. And I think one of the things we've seen certainly in the last 12 to 18 months is an increased focus on environmental justice. And so, as we think about, transitioning our economy to being more kind of equitable, inclusive, and just, taking care of those frontline communities and those disproportionately impacted by environmental concerns, being top of mind is another, I think, vector where you think through how, our government is going to respond. And I think there's just going to be an increased, more pointed tip of the spear when it comes to the regulatory environment for water. So those are all three things to me that, as I'm, analyzing and looking at what Congress and the administration might do, to me signal a increased focus in the space.
And you touched upon this, but there was massive bipartisan support. I think this was just past May, right? When the Senate passed the Drinking Water and Wastewater Infrastructure Act. But when you think about this comprehensive bill, and it's providing now, I guess, $35 billion over 5 years in sort of federal funding and financing to essentially focus on water infrastructure needs. How do you see the targets for this funding? And Joe, you want to take a first shot at that?
Well, yeah, and I think one of the opportunities in this space. So you, I think, saw a couple weeks ago, Congresswoman Bordeaux from the Atlanta region, and then Congressman Katko, a Democrat and a Republican, introduced legislation to help make remote monitoring and instrumentation-based testing a priority investment for the federal government. So I think they're going to be looking at future-proofing ways of regulatory compliance. So how do we, think through the opportunities to not only ensure environmental quality, but to do it in a kind of a data smart way? And so I think, increasingly we're going to be looking for, because, you've got, the, subnational governments, your state, your county, your municipal, your industrial users, your utilities, all, trying to think through how can we meet a certain threshold or metric of ensuring quality, but doing it in a smarter way. And I think that's increasingly where Congress is going to spend some time and effort, is to invest at, future-proofing compliance to make sure that not only are we doing a better job, but we're being smarter about it.
And Brent, from a policy and legal perspective, and looking at how these policies get implemented and how those funding, how that gets allocated, what are your thoughts around sort of the same question here of this water infrastructure bill?
Yeah, Meena, so I agree with Joe. I think there's going to be a greater focus on low income and rural communities. Most of the public water systems, the 54,000 public water systems exist out there, are smaller systems, are rural. Probably 86% of them are communities below 10,000 size. And so there's going to be a real focus on those communities. And there's a big, obviously Congress is really interested and concerned about the infrastructure crisis and the aging infrastructure and the impact it has on, public health and water quality. And so I think, Congress there's obviously a real desire to focus that on the communities that really need it. And we do realize that from water incident events like Flint, Michigan, that it's many times the disadvantaged communities and the low-income communities that simply don't have the resources needed to ensure they have safe, clean water. So I think Congress is going to be very cognizant of that when they adopt legislation and direct funds. And those funds, most of those funds will be directed to the SRFs. So then the states will decide how those funds are going to be used. But I think there's going to be a tremendous focus on ensuring that as we rebuild these failing systems, that the systems are rebuilt smartly and they're built with 21st century technologies, and that includes smart and remote monitoring. So.
Yeah, and based on all of these changes, and you always want people, process, and technology to kind of work in alignment for any change to happen. So as you're seeing policy changes coming in, regulatory changes coming in, and funding and financing happening for it, and you've heard, there's enough emphasis in the last 5 years for being digital. And as you're looking at all of these changes looming over the public utilities, I mean, how do you see them operating over the next 5 years from a standpoint of being digital, their workforce, looking at sort of their infrastructure, evaluating your own sustainability? I mean, how do you guys
It's a big change.
see that?
Yeah, there's going to be some substantial changes, and it's going to cost a lot. It's going to take time to basically move to this new paradigm. What I would say is, on different EPA programs, like the Clean Air Act program, they have been using real-time data monitoring and remote monitoring for years, and it's been legislatively codified to use those technologies. On the Clean Water Act side and the drinking water side, less so. And so EPA has been studying and advocating for real-time monitoring for a couple of years. I apologize. We got a pretty bad storm going on here behind me, so if you hear some lightning. So there's a real interest by EPA and a real desire to move to these new technologies in ensuring the integrity of water quality sampling, whether it's drinking water or wastewater. And so it's going to cost a lot of money. It's going to take a lot of time. We've been in discussions with EPA about these changes. The agency, well, their desire is to move quickly to these types of technologies. They have many rules and procedures in place that are arcane. The alternative to testing procedure policies that are geared towards traditional laboratory technologies and sampling. And so this is a brand new paradigm that we're looking at. And while EPA is embracing this and wants to do it, we're going to have to remove some barriers, whether they be regulatory, legislative barriers, and we will get there. I'm convinced, because I know that EPA believes that this is the right way to go. And EPA's policy for all these systems, drinking water, wastewater side, is to encourage systems to collect additional samples. They're required to take a certain amount of samples to ensure data, the sampling and the water quality is good and the water is safe and compliant with their permits. And they encourage systems to take more, but that costs a lot of money. And so, and there's laboratory capacity issues. So I think as these new technologies come on board, like KETOS, we're going to see those barriers essentially, evaporate. And so the regulations has to catch up to the technology. So regulatory arena is slower than the policy arena right now.
Of course. Joe, any thoughts to add on that?
Well, yeah, I'll actually offer an example. So I used to work at USDA with Secretary Vilsack, and one of the top priorities when it came to water quality, certainly for water systems in the US, was the confluence of climate change and agriculture. And it was close to Secretary Vilsack's heart, former Iowa governor, because you had nutrient loading in the Raccoon River feeding into Des Moines, and there were several instances of where it would shut down the water treatment plant. And so I think if you look at climate change, rising temperatures, some of the farming community, one of their most immediate ways to fight back is changing the application of pesticides and treatments. And a lot of times what that leads to is additional nutrient loading as they seek resilient solutions to yield. And so I think our ability to see through to what policymakers are going to prioritize is part of this transition. And I think, if you really look at the impacts of climate change, this challenge is going to become a steeper and steeper climb. And so I think that's the opportunity for folks to think about, is that as we, there's an overlay of climate, there's an overlay of environmental justice, ensuring the integrity of our water systems and having, I think, early markers and warnings is going to be paramount.
No, thank you. That was great from both of you. I think I could have like an individual workshop with each one of you for a day, and we'd still run short of topics. There's several programs designed by the US EPA to protect public health, ensuring safety of drinking water, the whole NPDES permitting policy that they do for discharge limits. And obviously the public drinking water systems are regulated by EPA, and I think that it's providing drinking water to almost, I think we can say 90% of Americans, whether you include authorized states, territories, and tribes. But through your decades of career, being both at the Hill, seeing the private side, the public sector side, when you look at the implementation side of this, applies to both Joe and Brent. We know what's important from a water quality monitoring standpoint. We know what the status quo has been. And we understand EPA's policy now coming. What is different now? Why do you think something is going to shift now compared to what last 50 years has happened?
Well, I'll take a crack at that. So I think it's a couple of things, Meena. First of all, it's awareness, a greater awareness of the risks that exist out there in drinking water and Clean Water Act in surface water. And also, I think it's an acknowledgement that technology is leaping forward, and there's these great new technologies that can ensure greater public health, ensure that water is safe, clean for the consumer, and can do it more cost effectively. And I think we, as EPA increases the regulatory burden on communities, and many of your listeners may be familiar with the unregulated contaminant monitoring rule the EPA has, and we're in UCMR 5, which imposes additional monitoring requirements across all U.S. Water systems, including many small systems, and that cost of sampling is going to be enormous going forward. And so I think EPA over time will simply have to recognize that the cost of monitoring these additional contaminants and regulating additional contaminants, they're going to have to recognize that those costs in an environment where affordability is an issue and where many communities simply can't afford the additional costs of regulations on wastewater and drinking water and stormwater, are going to have to recognize that they have to move to these more cost-effective technologies and sampling platforms.
And Joe, what are your thoughts around that?
Well, I think the social awareness, and Brent mentioned it, is really, really important. And I've already offered kind of a rural farm view of this, but one of the stories I like to tell people, this is a way of conceptualizing how we've evolved as a society, is that in the 50s, and if you've ever looked in a creek bed at a farm, when you were done with something, you'd roll a truck or a pickup or your washing machine, your fridge, you would just dump it in the creek, because that was our sensibility at the time. It was out of sight, out of mind. And we've made enormous strides. And so I think now, there was a report last year that we all ingest a credit card's worth of microplastics every week as humans, just because of exposure. And I think there's just increased public awareness that both in our water and in our air, what we consume as members of society it impacts our public health. And obviously there's disproportionate impacts. I think that's the other thing, is sometimes we make the mistake in our own lives of thinking that because we don't see it as a crisis for us, it's not a crisis for anybody. But I think there are many, many communities where this is at a crisis level. And I think that's where it is the role of the public sector and regulators to think through, how do we do our absolute best to protect the public? And as technology and data and monitoring evolves, the bar gets raised. And so as we make strides on what we can do to protect the public, it is, I think, incumbent on those public agencies like EPA and the state level environment departments to ensure that as our abilities and our capability grow, that we're ensuring that there's growth and improvements in our ability to drive better public health outcomes.
Yeah, Meena, can I follow up on that as well?
Yeah, jump in.
So Susan Bodine, former head of EPA's Enforcement Office, and I co-authored an article on the Hill a few weeks ago, and we cautioned, we applauded Congress for taking this issue seriously, but we cautioned them on simply throwing more money at these systems without requiring accountability, without asking these systems in exchange for receiving these public funds to bring their systems up to 21st century standards. One of the things that's concerned me over the years as somebody, well, I'll call a compliance nerd. I was a chief compliance officer for United Water, overseeing 200 water systems. I got to know the water sector pretty well, and I love water operators, and because they want to comply with their permits, and they're special people. And so I got to know a lot of water operators, but there's some really, and this may be kind of jumping into the weeds a little bit, but I think your listeners should understand it, because this is kind of what's going to drive additional change, policy change. For example, the current NPDES permitting program gives operators enormous discretion on when they collect samples to determine compliance with their permits. It can be 3 or 4 samples a month. Well, as many of your listeners know, operators are collecting operational samples all the time. So they know when their systems are in compliance and when they may not be in compliance. And when do you think operators will oftentimes, if they have discretion, they'll collect the samples. They'll collect them when they're in compliance. So our caution, so EPA has a system. They track the systems of, systems in non-compliance. And as I mentioned, there's several thousand public water systems that are in significant non-compliance. These are the ones we know about. What I would say is there's many more systems that are in non-compliance simply because it's not getting reported back to the state or EPA. And so, we, many of us that are in this sector recognize that data integrity is absolutely essential in order to ensure public health. And that's why when I found out about KETOS a number of years ago, when I was introduced to you, I got excited about KETOS because I said, wow, this really can help improve sampling and water quality integrity for these systems. So.
Thank you for sharing that, Brent, and thanks, Joe. It's interesting because when you are coming on the other side as policymakers and regulatory experts, and I'm sitting here more from a technology service provider standpoint, I would think that it's inevitable for EPA to realize that the future is continuous monitoring. The future is automated sampling and testing and analysis. And it should be more about the how versus the why, and how that how is going to get laid out. And I think the accountability part is something that is definitely weighing heavily, I think, on a lot of companies on how is this funds going to, is it going to go back to the same approach versus not using it to leap forward, right? How, in your experience, and this is a great point from just your experience with KETOS as well, is how difficult is it, and how do you perceive startups, or just, you have large legacy water companies that have, existed for decades, but how do you see startups or other technology innovators, and how difficult is it for them to sort of come into the water sector and try to do anything that actually needs compliance or regulatory approval? It's the one thing that investors run exactly 180 degrees from. So I'm very curious how you foresee, and how difficult is it, or is there change around the corner?
Do you want me to tackle that one? Was that directed to me, or is that Joe? Joe, you want to take that?
I'm wondering who's gonna take that one.
So let me take a crack at that. So when I was, I love the agency, I love EPA, and I love the people there because they come every day with a mission to make life better and improve public health and the environment. But many times, bureaucracies and regulations, it's very hard to change, the status quo, the way that we do things, and so. The agency, my experience in over the years of talking with them about these exciting technologies, is that they love the idea. They can't endorse companies, but they love the concept, and they recognize that this is kind of the future of water. And they're cautious about saying that, but if you talk to them quietly, they recognize this is where they need to go because they've been researching this. This is a focus, of theirs over the last, 15, 20 years, particularly focusing on water security. I mean, it's always better to have more information than not, and be able to, and if you can't process that information, then it's not any use to anybody. So the ability to collect additional samples to ensure compliance with the regulations and the laws, and be able to understand and know that information quickly to respond to it is absolutely critical. So EPA understands that. What I've said before, and I'll say again, is change is hard. These regulations, sometimes make it difficult for newcomers to come into this, into production, into use. But the EPA does seem committed to helping bring about this transformation, not necessarily for KETOS, but because they recognize that this is the future of water.
Awesome.
And I think that's right, Brent. The thing to me that's a real driver here, and it's worth recognizing that a lot of bureaucracies are kind of rooted in incumbent technologies, just because there's the legacy of time that creates that calcification. But one of the things that I think is really driving folks, and I think there's an opportunity here, is that this may not be the case for your municipal water users, but certainly for your industrials and your power generators, is there's increased focus on ESG, your environmental, social, and governance. And investors, there's trillions of dollars that are going to be moving through the ESG space, and I think access to capital is important, and it may not be catching up with you now, but I think increasingly there's more of a focus on ESG considerations. And so I think with kind of real-time remote monitoring and instrumentation, there's an opportunity to do two things. One is you could save money, so there's an opportunity to save on more collection and time delays and all things that I think are nuisance issues for most folks in the compliance space, but to do it in a easy, streamlined, kind of future-proofed way. But then two, also being able to tout the being at the tip of the spear and thinking about ways to drive results ahead of time. So not waiting for the regulators to come, and because you don't want to get flagged in a compliance sense, but doing the right thing and driving new solutions, because it's an opportunity for you to tout your environmental, social, and governance metrics and goals that you're setting out as a priority for the company. And I think there's just increased focus on that space. I think the ones that are ahead of the curve are going to be rewarded both from a regulatory standpoint, but even from a market or investor awareness standpoint.
Super insightful. Thank you for that, Joe. I know we're coming up on time, but I do want to, maybe have one last question here as you guys, as we try to wrap up in a minute here. Any words of just, wisdom for the audience, in the sense we typically tend to have a blend of utility water operators, and I think the water operators are superheroes. I mean, we expect them suddenly to become technology IT experts and then data analysts, and it's sort of like, where's their core expertise? How are we nurturing that? And I think those are some of the things that KETOS is always thinking from a business model perspective. But when you look at the utility audience joining today, what are some of the words of wisdom that you want to share with them in terms of just a takeaway? And it might be just planting some seeds of thought for them.
Yeah, from my perspective, many of the utilities that are interested in adopting these new technologies should work with their states, the primacy agencies, because in many cases the states are absolutely critical to kind of allowing these new technologies to be adopted, and those states then can obviously influence EPA and EPA's policy and even regulations. So I'd encourage them to to understand the value of these technologies and work with their regulators to, if they seek to adopt them, to work with the regulators to make that happen. And many state agencies are very interested and excited about these types of technology deployments.
Awesome. Joe, any parting thoughts there?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think there's been a huge focus on carbon, obviously, in the last couple of years, and I think because it's so front of mind for policymakers, that's kind of your first rung of the ladder. But I think these other resource concerns that are going to be primary for the next several decades are next up. So I think in the same way that you would think about your C-suite's focus on what's your net zero carbon, what are you doing to address climate, I think water is just as important and is going to be a focus for policymakers and investors at large. So I think paying the same heed that you do to carbon and your commitments that you're making on net zero, I think you should also be thinking about what are the water quality assurances and how can we make investments in that space to protect public health. I think that's now's the time to get ahead of that curve.
Awesome, thank you, Joe, Brent. Just thank you very, very much. Really, really appreciate your time. It's an absolute honor. And I have the easy job. I'm just popping the questions. So I'm really appreciative of both of you. And I hope both the technology service providers as well as the users both were able to take some words of wisdom from you and kind of noodle on them. I think the key for these sessions, we call them water cooler chats because we're still not completely 100% all in person. We're getting there. It's sort of just trying to get everybody out of their chairs into a, strolling around, just get a cup of coffee, relax, or a glass of wine, depending on where you are, and just intrigued enough to want to learn more and explore further. So I would encourage everyone in the audience, if you want to learn more about any of the pieces that Brent or Joe talked about, please feel free to reach out. Don't be shy. And also, if you want to learn further about how KETOS is working in the area of compliance, our team would be happy to share more. And we'll also be the session is recorded, so we'll be publishing it for people who have not been able to join to listen in. We have several questions coming in from the audience, but unfortunately, these are very tight and they're 30 minutes, but all of these questions will be answered, and I'll make sure that we have a blog published out for you guys with that. So have a great rest of the week, everyone. Hope to see you all in one of our next cooler chats. Stay safe. Thanks, everyone. Thanks again, Joe and Brent.
Yeah, thank you.